Hello everybody, welcome to Violent Analogies, the third of 6 online events the British Animal Studies Network is holding this spring under the banner Violence. It's always fantastic when the call for papers ends and I'm looking through the abstract and there are 3 papers that just sit together, especially if they are on an issue totally related to the general focus, but not one that I had necessarily thought of for this set of meetings. That was the case with the 3 papers we're going to hear today, focused on different questions, the use of the analogies in animal activism of Holocaust, slavery and genocide, to think about human-animal relations, questions of oppression, species and race in America, and questions of whether animals should be protected against hate speech. All 3 papers are contemplating these issues where animals have, do, can, should fit into the various analogic languages and imageries that we live with. As ever, we also have 3 different perspectives today. We have a scholar of cultural memory, a historian of African American studies, and an applied moral and political philosopher. We're going to hear each of the papers, they're all about 20 minutes long, and then we'll take questions at the end. So I'm going to invite Jessica. Do you want to show your face and begin to share your screen, and I will read your bio while that's going on. So Jesseka Batteau is an affiliate scholar at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry, Faculty of Humanities at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. As a cultural memory scholar, her focus is on language and media in the remembrance of shared pasts and their dynamic role in the processes of social, cultural and political transformation. Her dissertation, Literature, Memory and the Religious Past, published by Brill in 2021, discussed the iconic role of literary authors in the secularization of the Netherlands. At present, her specific research interest is in the representation of violence against animals, varying from the remembrance of the exploitation and repression of animals in the past to the witnessing of what takes place in factory farms and slaughterhouses in the present. She focuses on the discursive, visual, performative gestures deployed in various domains in literature, art, agriculture, politics, policymaking, and the media that leads to the invisibility of violence perpetrated against animals around the world. And today her talk is Historical Analogy, Multidirectional Memory and Violence Against Animals. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thanks, Erica, for your introduction. It's an honor to be able to speak here in the Holland. Human-animal relations and studies is not yet as developed as it is in the UK and the US, so I'm very happy to be able to speak here, and I hope to have a very interesting discussion later on as well. So in the following 20 minutes, I would like to offer a reflection on the usefulness of the notion of multidirectional memory, a concept that was introduced by Michael Rothberg, in thinking about representation and the acknowledgement of systemic violence done to animals in the animal industrial complexes. My interest is in the discursive, visual and performative dimensions of the representation of violence against animals in different arenas, as you already heard in my abstract. I have a background in cultural memory studies, and my goal is to investigate to what extent methods and tools from memory studies might be of use in thinking about the position of animals in our society. And in my talk, I will be talking about one particular historical analogy, namely that of the Holocaust, which has been used and still is in relation to the treatment of animals. So just a brief overview of what I'm going to be saying and talking about is pretty straightforward. I would like to talk a little bit about the Holocaust analogy, give some examples. Then I would like to talk about Holocaust memory as a more general field in which the analogy, let's say, is embedded. And say something about what my understanding is of collective memory and how we can use this concept. And then I will focus on the multidirectional memory concept of Michael Rothberg. And finally, I will think about or ask some questions about how we might expand this concept into the field of animal studies. So I'm sure many of you know a lot of well-known examples of this comparison of the Holocaust with violence against animals. And it's it's present in many different domains. It has each with its own particularities and effects, some graphic and explicit, some more implicit and oblique. So this is like this is the first example from, let's say, the domain of art by Sue Ko. Perhaps you know her as an artist. I've tried to describe each example with some keywords, just to say to show how each use of the analogy has its own specificity. So in this case, I would say the analogy is explicit. It's very clear. We see animals dragged to their deaths at the slaughterhouses, and it is captioned by a quotation from Adorno, which is Auschwitz begins whenever someone looks at a slaughterhouse and thinks they are only animals. So it has an aesthetic value, it is visual, but it is also discursive. Another example is from popular media, popular culture. These are two films. I'm sure many of you know them as well. At least Babe is very famous, of course, and Okja, which is a more recent film by the South Korean director Bong Joon-ho. Both of these movies are set within the domain of factory farming and include dark scenes that remind us visually of concentration camps and the apparatus of violence, containment, and objectification. And here I would say the connection is made implicitly and visually, and it is also immersive. So we are, as a viewer, taken into the scenes that are portrayed. You are part of this, you become part of the scene. Then we have, of course, many examples from animal liberation groups. I could give a host of examples, but maybe the most famous or infamous one is from PETA, Holocaust on Your Plate, the campaign in 2003, which toured with 5 square meter panels, which juxtaposed images of the Holocaust with images of factory farmed animals. Animal Rights 2018, so this is far more recent, also uses an image which the tattoos on the arms of prisoners of concentration camps are juxtaposed with an image of a tattoo of the ear of a farmed animal. I think it's a calf. So here we see a very explicit, often graphic, visual, as well as discursive, and often also performative, because these are campaigns that tour with activists performing, let's say, this analogy in the public domain. And finally, one last example is from literature, which is also my background. My cultural memory interest started from my literary studies interest. We all know the analogy made by Singer, I think, Isaac Bashevis Singer, in which he, in a short story called The Letter Writer, served as the title for Charles Patterson's book, Eternal Treblinka, Our Treatment of Animals and the Holocaust. And this book of Patterson, which is a historical book, investigates the complex connective tissues between the Holocaust and factory farming. And the quotation from the letter writer it reads as follows. And it's expressed by a protagonist who has lost his family to the Holocaust, to the Nazis, and who has just lost a mouse that he has befriended, and this mouse has died. And then he reflects, what do they know, all these scholars, all these philosophers, all the leaders of the world, about such as you? They have convinced themselves that man, the worst transgressor of all the species, is the crown of creation. All other creatures were created merely to provide him with food, pelts, to be tormented, exterminated. In relation to them, all people are Nazis. For the animals, it is an eternal Treblinka. And this last sentence is often quoted also by animal activists. The question of the moral legitimacy or appropriateness of the comparison has been hotly debated, and it has led to many different positions. But there has as yet not been a thorough discussion of what these comparisons have in fact effectuated in the public sphere. Have they made the plight of animals more visible? And if so, what exactly has been made visible? The Holocaust analogy is, of course, not one thing. The different positions on its moral appropriateness are dependent on the interpretation of what exactly is being compared, where the similarity is identified. Are we comparing the victims of violence? Are we comparing the reasons for torture and violence? Are we comparing the material dimensions of the systems of killing? Are we comparing the way in which responsibility for these crimes are diffused? Are we saying that animals are objectified the way the victims of the Holocaust were dehumanized, etc.? What interests me is why individuals and groups resort to this analogy in the first place. Each invocation of the Holocaust analogy asks for a thorough investigation of its discursive, visual, material, and performative, as well as political context and its parameters. What in fact does the analogy consist of, and what does it affect? And these are the questions that are at the moment at the heart of my project. And here we see the book by Charles Patterson. So, in my view, the implications of the Holocaust analogy for animal studies cannot be fully understood without its contextualization in the long-standing and complex traditions of Holocaust remembrance. How we remember the horrors of Nazism is the result of many decennia of intensive memory work in a wide array of domains, both outside as well as within academia. So many traditions of commemoration have evolved, so much scholarship has been devoted to the study of Holocaust memory worldwide, that a summary of the history of Holocaust remembrance is quite impossible. What we can do is establish certain generic characteristics of how memory processes operate. Holocaust memory or Holocaust memories are collectively produced, performed, circulated, and activated by groups and individuals. To put it simply, the memory of the Holocaust does not consist of one narrative with one meaning, is not stable or a demarcated entity. It is subject to complex processes of exchange, remediation, appropriation, and transformation that characterize the dynamics of collective memory work in general. So my point would be that the analogy is very much embedded within a broader field of Holocaust memory practice and scholarship. So if we are talking about collective memory, and this is a field in itself, so I'll try to give a short definition and description. There are many terms circulating to refer to shared processes of meaning make in reference to the past. Michael Rothberg cites Richard Turdiman and offers a minimalist definition. Collective memory is the past made present. And there's another definition which can be added to this, and this one is from Alain Confino and Peter Fritsche. Memory is a symbolic representation of the past embedded in social action, and it is a set of practices and interventions. So based on these two pretty brief definitions, we could come to some conclusions about what collective memory is, or what its basic features are. And I would say, in the first place, it's a contemporary phenomenon. So it's concerned with the past, but it always takes place in the present. So it's always concerned with what people, let's say, with interests that are of importance in the present, and that determines what we remember and how we remember. And it is active, so it's a form of work, a form of labor. And there's a circulation, a sort of transference between the individual and the collective. So there are memories, individual memories that are made public and thus shared and become, let's say, collective and are transferred back to other individuals who can, again, project that into the public sphere. So there's this private and public dynamic. So multidirectional memory. Well, this is the concept I would like to introduce here, and I'm very curious to hear if it sounds promising also in the context of animal studies, a broader context of animal studies. So in his book, Michael Rothberg addresses one of the most pressing problems in contemporary society, namely, how to think about the relationship between different social groups' histories of victimization. Rothberg's project is propelled by a series of questions. What happens when different histories confront each other in the public sphere? Does the remembrance of one history erase others from view? When memories of slavery and colonialism bump up against memories of the Holocaust in contemporary multicultural society, must competition of victims ensue? In thoroughly researched case studies on intellectuals and artists ranging from Hannah Arendt to Dubois, he demonstrates how early Holocaust memory emerged in dialogue with the dynamic transformations and multifaceted struggles defining the era of decolonization. Throughout, Rothberg re-narrates the received history of Holocaust memory and uncovers a marginalized tradition that has implications for both Holocaust studies and post-colonial studies. He argues that Far from blocking other historical memories from view in a competitive struggle for recognition, the emergence of Holocaust memory on a global scale has contributed to the articulation of other histories, some of them predating Nazi genocide, such as slavery, others taking place later, such as the Algerian War of Independence or the genocide in Bosnia in the 1990s. His analysis lead to a series of propositions about the nature of memory practice, and in particular those that are invested in the making present of traumatic histories. He challenges important assumptions about how memories operate in the public sphere. So his first point is that one should see the interaction between different traumatic histories not as competitive, whereby memories of one group eclipse those of others, but to see memory as a subject to ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing and borrowing, as productive and not privative. Second, he states memories are not owned by separate demarcated groups. His theory challenges received ideas about the one-on-one connection between memory and identity, the idea that the boundaries of memory parallel boundaries of group identity. He posits that memories are not owned by groups, nor are groups owned by memories. Rather, the borders of memory and our identity are jagged. What looks at first like my own property often turns out to be a borrowing or adaptation from a history that initially might seem foreign or distant. Memory's anachronistic quality is bringing in the here, in the now and then here and there, is actually the source of a powerful creativity, its ability to build new worlds out of the materials of older ones. In other words, Rothberger encourages us to think about the public sphere as a malleable discursive space in which groups do not simply articulate established positions, but actually come into being through the dialogical interactions with others. So both subjects and spaces of the public are open to continual reconstruction. Finally, another conclusion from what Rothberg proposes is that multidirectional memory has the potential to engender movements of justice. The model of multidirectional memory proposed by him challenges exclusive versions of cultural identity and points out how remembrance both cuts across and binds together diverse spatial, temporal, and cultural agents and sites. He quotes Nancy Fraser, political philosopher, that historians and theorists need to move beyond issues of economic retribution and cultural recognition and account for the issue of political representation. So whether the issue is distribution or recognition, disputes that used to focus exclusively on the question of what is owed as a matter of justice to the community members now turn quickly into disputes about who should count as a member and which is the relevant community. In reference to Fraser, Rothberg points towards the importance of meta-political issues which frame disputes of justice, determining who is permitted to claim the right to speak about issues of injustice affecting them. So this is, in short, very briefly, the points made by Michael Rothberg. And now I'd like to try to think of how we might expand this idea of his ideas into the realm of animal studies and thinking about the plight of animals in our societies. Based on Rothberg's work, we can acknowledge that the Holocaust memory can and has already made possible the recognition of violence, trauma, and pain suffered by other groups in history. If we see the analogy of the Holocaust as potentially creative and productive, as fostering new visions of justice, as part of an ongoing dialogue about how we remember many different violent pasts and presents, we can start looking at its workings within the context of animal rights and animal liberation movements. Multidirectional memory allows for a non-competitive and inclusive approach of the recognition of violence against animals. It may even contribute to a repositioning of animals as being part of a larger community of human and non-human living beings, and who are thus also owed recognition and representation. My goal is to investigate what forms of multidirectional memory are indeed productive in raising awareness for the plight of animals. This asks for an attentiveness to the parameters and context in which analogies function. Several questions arise when trying to think through the idea of multidirectional memory in relation to animals. Most importantly, and obviously, in contrast to the examples that Rothberg has studied, animals do not have access to the public domain as human animals do. They cannot represent themselves, let alone invoke memories of violent past to raise awareness for their plight. The question then arises whether humans can remember vicariously for non-human animals. What are the implications when writers, artists, scholars, or animal activists invoke the analogy of the Holocaust or other violent histories for them? In these cases, it's not about staking out a claim for your own or our own group and memories, but about making visible violence against others that is completely interwoven with our own existence. I think this is where the idea of non-exclusive memory proposed by Rothberg is useful. The realization that memories are not exclusive to certain groups and certain identities, and that the boundaries between groups, identities, and memories are ragged and porous. We might thus be able to reframe metapolitical conditions in such a way that animals are recognized as legitimate subjects of justice and recognition as members of a broader human and non-human mnemonic community. Another question is whether it would be productive to deploy other concepts and practices that are associated with the remembrance of traumatic histories of genocide, of slavery, war. The concept of perpetratorship comes to mind, but also practices of witnessing and testimony. By critically engaging with these concepts and practices from a memory studies perspective, we might be able to develop a mnemonic repertoire that is tailored to the specificity of the violence against animals. In conclusion, my hope is that the deployment of multidirectional thinking and scholarship might lead to a better understanding of commemorative practices that bear witness to the past and present past and present violence against animals, and also that this approach might help pave the way for a new meta-political framework which allows for an emancipation of animals in our society. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Jesseka. That was really, really interesting and a fantastic start for us. Yeah, some applause coming up there. So that's brilliant. Thank you. We'll come back with questions later. So can I now invite Tom to show his face and begin to share his screen, please. So welcome our second speaker. Thomas Aiello is Professor of History and African American Studies at Valdosta State University in Georgia. He's the author of The Grapevine of the Black South, the Scott newspaper syndicate in the Generation Before Civil Rights Movement, 2018, among many others. And his book, Jim Crow's Last Stand, Non-Unanimous Criminal Jury Verdicts in Louisiana, 2015, helped spark a movement that constitutionally overturned the state's non-unanimous, I can't speak, jury law. A second edition appeared in October. Though most of his work to this point has been human-centered, he's now also a doctoral student in anthrozoology at the University of Exeter, studying critical animal studies and the history of American speciesism. And his talk today is Death to Pigs, Animals, Race, and the Semiotics of Material Culture in the United States. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks so much. Before I start, I just want to briefly mention that even though the pictures I'm going to show you today are drawings, they're not photographs, some of them still are disturbing. So I just kind of want to warn you about that. What happens, asked political scientist Charles Hamilton, when a Black Panther is shot and he knows he has no value to the policeman who sees a Black man when he sees him? It was the question at the heart of the Black radical use of pig as an epithet for police. If the policeman could not see value in Black life, then Black commentators would interpret no value in police life. It was, however, a simple equation that seemed justifiably retributive when only the humans on both sides were taken into account. When the pigs themselves complicated that equation, the method of retributive attacks seemed less justifiable. The behavior of American law enforcement against groups like the Black Panthers was unconscionable, including dozens of murders and assassinations and even more gratuitous prison sentences. But the pig appellation used by the Panthers and other groups only associated such bad behavior with a non-human animal who demonstrated none of those problematic qualities and who was killed by the millions every day. The use of pig as a charge against authority put the protagonists of an ugly racial story in the role of antagonists in a simultaneous and intersectional species story. That charge played out through the late 60s and early 1970s in the countercultural student movement and the Black Power wave of the civil rights movement. It spread throughout the nation in fiction, music, and art, but its most complete representation came in the illustrations of Emory Douglas, Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party. Pig imagery served as a successful crib for a wider and more complex critique of American policing and imperialism. But in making that crib, it belittled pigs themselves, not only making a vulnerable non-human animal all the more vulnerable. The genesis of such imagery in the late 1960s is often attributed to the Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland, California in October of 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. But while they certainly popularized the insult and helped it spread to radical political organizations and student protest groups across the nation, it wasn't new. As early as 1546, pigs were being used as derogatory terms for boorish men, and the epithet continued through the centuries. Images during the French Revolution, for example, depicted Louis XVI as a pig. Beginning in 1811, the term first appeared in print as an insulting stand-in for police officers. The English Lexicon Bellatriconium, an urban dictionary of sorts, listed a pig as a police officer. The term continued across the centuries and across the ocean, in regular use as synonymous with the police through the Progressive era. Pigs were, explains Peter Stallybrass and Alan White, a site of competing, conflicting, and contradictory definitions. They became exemplars of poverty, filth, and vice, meaning that disassociation from pigs in an age of social mobility could become a signpost of proper middle-classness. Steve Baker has produced the most systemic analysis of animal imagery as human insult. Such actions, he argues, will call on common knowledge and received ideas, but will also offer unexpected insights into embedded but unstated cultural assumptions regarding the object status of animals, and into how such assumptions are deployed either to bolster our own sense of identity or to undermine that of others. The art of Emory Douglas and the police pig narrative of the late 1960s and early 1970s demonstrates that the line between the two forms was far more malleable in the American rhetoric of the age. Usually directed at men, pig designated anyone nationally or internationally who violated human rights. They were a people concerned about protecting property over and against the lives of humans. What is a pig? Asked one 1968 Black Panther article. A low-natured beast that has no regard for law, justice, or the rights of the people. A creature that bites the hand that feeds it. A foul, depraved traducer, usually found masquerading as the victim of an unprovoked attack. Such definitions allowed pig, despite criticism, to remain a powerful metaphor for many in the movement. Sonia Sanchez, for example, published her first volume of poetry in 1969. Her definition for Black children read, "A policeman is a pig and he should be in a zoo with all the other piggy animals. And until he stops killing Black people, cracking open their heads, remember, the policeman is a pig. Oink, oink." Sanchez was the poet laureate of the Black Power movement, one of the leaders of the corresponding Black arts movement. Her reach was vast in that particular world. And hers was a language that, in the process of demeaning the violence of police against Black bodies, supported zoos and belittled non-human animals. But the art that did the most work to create such consequences was that of the Black Panther Party's Minister of Culture, Avery Douglas was an artist trained at the City College of San Francisco in 1967, a year after the founding of the Black Panthers. Douglas met Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and agreed to design the Black Panther newspaper. He would shape the periodical over the next 12 years, and with it, the image of the Panthers themselves, spreading that image to a larger and larger audience. By 1970, the Black Panther had a weekly circulation of more than 139,000. Although the use of the term pig to label the police is oft attributed to Newton and Seale, explains Carrie Moyer, the image that the word conjures up is all Douglas's own. For Moyer, Douglas's pigs are crudely compelling as they totter about on their hind legs, surrounded by flies. Whether drunk with power or simply clueless, the beasts are drawn with a glee befitting a 22-year-old who has just been anointed first revolutionary artist by the Black Panther Party. As Colette Gator has explained, Douglas constructed a visual mythology of power for people who felt powerless and victimized. He was, in that sense, the Norman Rockwell of the ghetto, concentrating on the poor and oppressed. While police-related pig imagery existed before him, Douglas's art would make it the dominant insult for law enforcement and the entire capitalist military-industrial complex over the following decade. "What is a pig?" asks one of Douglas's images, giving the standard Panther definition in response. The injured pig in the poster is unkempt and surrounded by flies. The inference is that the pig is a figure of unjust authority, an enemy of minority rights and justice, injured because of battle fatigue, as groups like the Black Panthers are having an impact and cracking the edifice of power that the pig represents. It is impossible to come away from such an image, however, without a disdain for pigs themselves, whatever they might represent. The pig's clothing bears no marks or symbols signifying that he is a stand-in for police or other figure of authority. The image is anthropomorphized, but the accompanying caption includes nothing that couldn't be said of a non-human animal. Thus, the image works as a critique of authority if a viewer comes to it with requisite contextual knowledge of the pitched battle between the Black Panthers and the police in Oakland. But for others without such context, it simply acts as a denouncement of pigs themselves. And even for those with an understanding of American racial codings, it would be impossible not to leave the image without negative connotations related to non-human animals. Other of Douglas's images do much the same work, while including more specificity about the human targets of his disdain. Perhaps the most common of his pig representations are members of the police. They are depicted as violent and intrusive, but also as feckless and incompetent. They are thus to be resisted and despised, but also to be seen as fundamentally inferior, unable to complete decidedly human tasks. Such formations obviously do their work against the police, but the process of dehumanization, combined with clear inferiority claims, do similar work against pigs. Incompetence, of course, does not encourage disdain or pity for human manifestations of pigness. It also encourages active resistance. Pigs as police in one of these images use ugly racial invective to intimidate a working-class Black human who responds with lye and acid, presumably to kill them, to do by any means necessary, unless you got something better. In the other image, a pig as policeman stands on a pedestal seeking to intimidate a group of Black humans. But the humans all have guns trained on the pig. All power to the people, the poster says. Community control of police. The people in this formulation are humans, the police, the non-humans. One has all power, the other is under community control. The messages depicted in pig as police imagery are also combined in some of Douglas's work. This image repeats the definition of pigs, refers to them as fascists, and references in particular the April 6, 1968 murder of Black Panther Bobby Hutton by Oakland police and the lack of accountability for that attack. The poster depicts pig policemen as firing guns drunkenly. Flies buzz around them. Meanwhile, the mayor and chief of police, also depicted as pigs, agree not to prosecute those cops who actually murder members of the Black community. It is a demonstration that pigness does not translate solely to law enforcement and those immediately involved in the brutality of Black lives and bodies. Those representatives of authority seen to guide the hands or hooves of policemen are also depicted as pigs. Pigs are, in effect, representatives of the state. These images elaborate on Douglas's broader police themes. Community control of police shows a pig depiction of the state being blown apart. I Surrender shows another pig depiction of the state running away in fear from the bullets and grenade of, the viewer is to assume, the Black Panthers. Finally, another image trumpeting all power to the people shows a panoply of guns trained on yet another pig depiction of the state. Pigs are not only representations of an unresponsive government, but representations of non-humans who are justified subjects of normalized violence. And that kind of violence was inherently necessary in Douglas's estimation, because left to their own devices, the pigs as state would spread beyond the bounds of the city, the country, or even the world. In whatever is good for the oppressor has got to be bad for us, representatives of the pig state have taken a pig rocket to the moon and brought with them a group of Black human slaves to help colonize it. The pig leader warns his compatriots to handle those slaves with care, because we're going to need them for Mars, Pluto, and all those other planets. In whites only, the pigs have finally conquered the moon and have managed to segregate it. To that end, there are also in Douglas's work pig representatives of the President of the United States for the first 3 years of the Panthers' existence, Lyndon Johnson. Two of the Johnson images feature toilets, making scatological references to the president that also jibe with assumptions about pigs made apparent by slogans such as "happy as a pig in shit." In one of the images, Johnson is being flushed down the toilet. In the other, he is defecating in an outhouse on a toilet crafted from an American flag. The third image, even more disturbing, features 4 lynched pigs, representing the political leaders assumed to be responsible for the worst abuses of the American fight in Vietnam: Johnson, Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, and Robert Kennedy. The poster features a quote from Douglas himself, arguing that landscape art is only good when it shows the oppressor hanging by a tree from his motherfucking neck. The stark imagery and the quote that accompanies it are an inversion of the common early century imagery of Black lynching victims so common in the United States. Douglas also depicted politicians other than Lyndon Johnson, who left office in January 1969. This image portrays the 1968 election to replace him, wherein Democrat Hubert Humphrey and Republican Richard Nixon fight over the mantle of white supremacy, while arch white supremacist candidate George Wallace looks on. In attaching such values to pigs, the image belittles such prejudices and portrays them as less than human. But at the same time, it props up the assumption that less than human is an existing category and not its own form of supremacy. Human supremacy in aid of belittling white supremacy was effective for many because of cognitive dissonance and basic human assumptions about species superiority. But it was disastrous for the pigs themselves, who became the receptacles of all such negative connotations. And many of those negative connotations related to the dangers of both domestic and international imperialism. The images of pigs as imperialists are also common in Douglas's art. 2 of these images portray the same message: get out of the ghetto, get out of Latin America, get out of Asia, get out of Africa. Such posters do the work of tying foreign imperialism to domestic white supremacy, interpreting the domestic police force that patrolled Black neighborhoods as similar to the military force that invaded a variety of nations in the global South. Another image presents an axe chopping down the pig tree of American imperialism, which places the weed of Black capitalism in danger. It is a visual renunciation of the Black middle class as dependent upon white supremacy for its success, a renunciation made for decades by Black radical movements. It is, however, significant that in this new visual reformulation, even the image of a tree is coded as a pig to demonstrate its association with the imperial project. The final image, a cover for the Black Panthers periodical, presents the United States as a mother sow suckling her children who represent other European colonial nations. Douglas also includes Japan and the apartheid states of Rhodesia and South Africa. The most prominent of the piglets, however, the one actually suckling at the teat of the US, is Israel. It is no surprise then that Douglas's takedown of imperial thinking would also include a takedown of Zionism as another version of segregationist apartheid. In Israel, Zionist puppet of imperialism, a group of pigs representing the United States, Britain, West Germany, and France overfeed a pig representing world Zionism a bottle of money to support its efforts. It was a demonstration of the view of Douglas and the Panthers that military occupations and support for Israel were part and parcel of the same project, a manifestation of the Black nationalist position that saw American mistreatment of its Black population as working in concert with imperialism. There was, however, an added element that played on fears of a Jewish cabal for domination and a stereotype of a Jewish hunger for money. That kind of problematic bigotry and representation, both the message against imperialism and the Jewish stereotyping, covers the problematic representation that hides in plain sight in this and other Panther imagery, that of pigs as stand-ins for all problematic figures and problematic behavior. And it is that porcine stereotype that left the highest of body counts, whether compared to American police actions against Black power organizations, European colonial efforts, African apartheid states, or Israeli occupation. In this image, for example, Douglas draws a direct line between local police and American soldiers, with a National Guard that worked in areas both foreign and domestic in between them. That kind of comparison and the emphasis on occupation ensure that the military would also be pilloried as pigs. The images are by now familiar, but use pigs to represent soldiers rather than policemen as the target of their ire. In each, the pig soldiers are either injured or being attacked. It was a common theme in Douglas's art. The pictures were evidence that non-human symbols could be used to represent a variety of different human ills in a variety of different forms. The one commonality in the images is that non-human animals are always representations of violence and negativity. Human animals are always representation of protagonists, whether victims or defenders. Douglas's artwork found common cause in the rhetoric of the era, coming both from the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers in particular, and the countercultural student movement, only reinforcing the notion that pigs were part of the problem, that their deaths were to be encouraged. And nowhere was that rhetoric more normalized than in the language of the Black Panthers. Even after the epithets of a given moment are reclaimed by their targets and fed back to those in the original angry group, there remains at base an understanding that the humans on both sides of a given divide are still subjects. The non-human animals, the epithetical terms themselves, are nothing more than objects. The pigs in such namings are the only group that consistently lose. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. That was, again, another really, really interesting paper. We'll come back for questions later. So I'm going to call now, thank you, there's all the applause coming through there, on Josh to share his screen with us. So final speaker today is Josh Milburn, who's a British Academy postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. He's working on a research project entitled Food, Justice and Animals Feeding the World Respectfully. His research interests are in applied moral and political philosophy, especially relating to animals and food, as well as in animal studies more broadly. His research has been published or is forthcoming in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies, the Journal of Applied Philosophy, the Journal of Agricultural and Environmental Ethics, the Journal of Social Philosophy, Environmental Values, Res Publica, Between the Species, Animal Studies Journal, and the Critical Review of International Social and Political Philosophy, as well as in volumes from Oxford University Press, Palgrave, Macmillan, Routledge, and Springer. He is a section editor for the journal Politics and Animals, a member of the Vegan Society's Research Advisory Committee, and the new host of the long-standing animal studies podcast, Knowing Animals. And his paper today is, Should We Protect Animals from Hate Speech? Thanks, Josh. You're on mute, Josh. You need to unmute yourself, Josh. I don't know what's going on.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. Perfect.
Okay, apologies for that. So, as has been said, I'm Josh. I'm actually based in a politics department these days, and I am, as was said, a big fan of an interdisciplinary vision of animal studies. And to that end, I currently host Knowing Animals. If you don't know that podcast, please do check it out. We interview animal studies scholars and release an episode every other week. So this paper today is co-written with my colleague at Sheffield, Alistair Cochrane. Now, some of you might know his work. He's been very important in shifting animal ethics from the kind of moral philosophy sphere to the political philosophy sphere, asking questions about the place of animals in political societies. But this is a paper that would be more classified as legal theory now, or jurisprudence perhaps, or philosophy of law. Now, we've been working on this paper for a number of years, and I'm quite excited to say it's now been accepted. So it's imminently forthcoming in the journal, the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies. So let me just jump straight in. Imagine a group, let's call them the White Defence League, who distribute leaflets in a residential area. In their leaflets, the White Defence League decry the propaganda spread by anti-racists and argue that white people are morally superior to those of other races. They further argue that white people should prioritise other white people, even if that means ignoring the exploitation, suffering and death of non-white people. Now, if the White Defence League were operating in a liberal state with laws against hate speech, such as the UK, we can expect that their members might face prosecution. Criminal prosecution under these laws. And this kind of thing does happen. So the picture on the right, I'm sure these faces might be familiar to many of you. We have Jada Franson, who is on the left, and Paul Golding, who's on the right. And these are two members of Britain First, which is a pressure group concerned with race relations. They've both been prosecuted again and again and again for distributing supposedly racist leaflets. But now imagine a different group, we call the Human Defence League. The Human Defence League also distributes leaflets in the same residential area. And in their leaflets, they decry the propaganda spread by animal rights and vegan activists. They argue that humans are morally superior to other animals and that humans should prioritise other humans, even if that means ignoring the exploitation, suffering, death and violence towards non-human animals. Now, while the claims of the Human Defence League and the White Defence League are very similar, other than the fact, of course, that one decries animals, whereas one decries a group of humans, the Human Defence League would not be subject to censure under hate speech laws in the United Kingdom, or indeed, as far as I know, any other actual state. There's also a discrepancy between the legal response we could expect to these two groups. And this paper is essentially an exercise in exploring whether there is any justification for that discrepancy. Let me repeat that. There's a discrepancy in the way that these two groups are talked about. And we, the authors, are interested in the quite theoretical question of what kind of justification there might be for that discrepancy. In theory, theoretical work about hate speech law, what justification could there be for including one group while excluding the other? Let me just offer a few quick caveats before I jump into that. Here are some questions that I'm decidedly not asking. I'm not asking the question of whether we should have hate speech laws at all. That's a very controversial issue in moral, legal, political philosophy, and indeed real world political practice. I think that our conclusion is actually compatible with either the claim that we should have hate speech laws or that we should not. We're not so much arguing for a substantive conclusion as arguing for a particular comparison, or sorry, arguing that a particular comparison reveals something interesting. We're not saying anything about non-criminal laws. There are non-criminal ways to think about hate speech, and we're not interested in those. We are not offering any particular account of what hate speech is, and consequently, we're not offering any particularly stark examples of what would constitute anti-animal hate speech. And the reason we're not doing these things is, again, that we are taking that slightly more theoretical step, and we're asking about in-principle differences. And the thing is that different accounts of what constitutes hate speech are going to have, different accounts of what justifies anti-hate speech legislation are going to have different accounts of what constitutes hate speech. And given that we're exploring a range of these, we don't offer any concrete account of what hate speech is. And very decidedly, we are not equating the worth or value of animals with those of non-white people. Okay, nor are we equating speciesism with racism. We recognize that there are differences here. I'll say a little bit more about it in a second. Instead, we're asking a very specific question about the foundations of hate speech law, and that is what, if anything, justifies the discrepancy between legal reactions to the White Defence League and legal reactions to the Human Defence League. We give over most of the paper to exploring these possible justifications for the discrepancy, and to anticipate, we find them all wanting. And what that means is that we suggest that in principle, there is no reason to support the censure of the White Defence League while not supporting the censure of the Human Defence League. We split our possible justifications for the discrepancy into two. I will give a very quick run through of the various different approaches, but I'll give a slightly deeper dive into some of them just by way of demonstration. We can come to more in the questions if people are interested. Those two categories of defences are non-consequentialist defences, which point to something about the comparison or something about the shape of the speech itself, and those that are harm-based. That is, those that are concerned with the particular kinds of harm that hate speech either constitutes or leads to, and suggests that the harm plays out in different ways when the speech is targeting human groups as to when it is targeting non-human groups. So let me dip into some of our possible justifications for the discrepancy, and then I will conclude. So first of all, we have our non-consequentialist justifications of the discrepancy. First one I'm not going to talk about in any detail because of time constraints, but that is the claim that one group is talking about something that is true, the other is talking about something that is untrue. I'd rather come to the second, which I think is one that immediately springs to mind when the problem that we are addressing is brought up. And that is the suggestion that race and species are different kinds of thing. So the very opening analogy, the very opening problem is not a problem because race and species are different things. So we don't need to worry about the apparent discrepancy. Now, again, I want to stress that we acknowledge that there's a difference between race and species. We acknowledge that racism and speciesism work in different kinds of ways. But of course, the existence of difference does not undermine the possibility of an analogy. Of course, an analogy only works if there is difference. You know, that's the nature of analogies. So we can test the extent to which race and species are problematically disanalogous in this case by looking to what are called formal specifications. Now, formal specifications are something that we find in the literature on hate speech, that is the academic literature, but also, political discussions and discussions in courts about the, how can I put this? Formal specifications are ways of delineating those kinds of characteristics which warrant the protection of hate speech laws from those that do not. This is best illustrated by way of example. So we might think that it is appropriate that I am protected from hate speech targeting my race, while it is not appropriate that I am protected from quote unquote hate speech targeting my choice of profession, for example. So people can't attack me or criminal prosecution for attacking me on the basis of my race, but not on the basis of the fact that I'm an academic or a philosopher or what have you. So one example of a formal specification would be whether something is immutable or changeable. Race is basically immutable, right? We can't change our race, but we can change our profession. We do. I've changed my profession in the past. There's every chance I will change it again in the future. We might point to the fact that that race is unchosen, while profession is to a degree chosen. We don't choose our racial belonging, or at least not straightforwardly, but we do have a degree of choice over our profession. There are a few others as well. These are 5 that we borrowed from the literature. The others are a little bit more complicated, but I can go into them if preferred. The bottom line is that none of these seem to be useful for demarcating race and species. For example, both race and species appear to be immutable. We cannot change our race and species at will, or even at great effort. And both race and species appear to be unchosen. None of us chose to be a member of the race or the species of which we are a part, and we cannot choose to cease being, or at least not straightforwardly. Now, next worry might be that the particular groups are disanalogous. So it's not the fact of species versus race, but the particular groups that are talked about. Okay, so non-white people versus non-human animals, for example. Don't want to get into that because I'd rather move on to the harm-based justifications of the discrepancy, for the simple reason that these speak to the kinds of reasons we might be worried about hate speech altogether. They are not perhaps technical points, but rather more substantive. And indeed, they allow us to draw upon some of the more interesting work in animal studies and animal ethics for the last few years, or what I think of as much of the more interesting work in animal ethics and animal studies of the last few years. Of course, some of you will disagree with me on that. So what these do is these say, how do we justify hate speech legislation? Well, we justify it on the basis that the individuals targeted are harmed in particular kinds of ways. And the suggestion is made that the non-human animals are not harmed in the same kind of way. So first, and I'm not going to talk about this, is the harm of wounding. This is the idea that being the target of hate speech leads to particular kinds of feelings of well, wounding is the word that's used, but it's about the emotional subjective response. I'm not going to get into that. Okay, slightly more, I think, for these purposes, interesting thought. The thought is that the White Defence League's words might wrongfully inculcate a hostile environment, whereas the Human Defence League's words do not. What's this idea of a hostile environment? The thought is that hate speech, acts of hate speech can create a hostile environment which acts as a tinderbox, not only for violent attacks and assaults, but in other important harms too. And this can lead to the normalization of these kinds of speech acts, which in turn leads to further harms. So a resulting climate of hatred might, to quote Alexander Brown, cause members of the targeted group to be more likely to face discrimination in the workplace, to be excluded from the political process and the top positions in society, to be ignored in matters of social justice, to find it more difficult to gain access to education, housing and healthcare, to be more likely to experience mistreatment at the hands of the police, to suffer miscarriages of justice, and so on. The trouble with this justification, it might have become clear as I was reading that, it's not entirely clear why we should think that members of human racial minorities are more at risk of this than are non-human animals. Indeed, we might think that we have no way of knowing that the White Defence League speech will create a more hostile environment for its targets than the Human Defence Leagues. While members of racial minorities suffer seriously from violence, discrimination and injustice, so too do animals. Indeed, tens of billions are slaughtered every year. Given this, there seems to be no obvious way that we can identify the causal links between the White Defence League speech and violence against non-white people, and while denying the Human Defence League's the link between the Human Defence League speech and violence against non-human animals. Indeed, there might be reasons that we could think that anti-animal speech is more harmful, given the fact that the audience of the speech is already engaging in violence against animals, or at least actively supporting violence against animals, whereas any support they offer for violence against the kinds of humans might be much more indirect. Now, a worry might be, to echo Dinesh Wadiwell, who spoke a couple of weeks ago in this format, but we're already waging a war against animals. How could things get any worse? Well, I think, yeah, things could get worse. We could roll back protections we already have for animals. People could start eating more meat, for example, or modest animal welfare laws where they exist could be rolled back. So things could get worse. But also, I allow that perhaps what we're doing here could be described as philosophy of law for a more just world. And what we mean by that is that we are not necessarily committed, in fact, we're not committed at all to the claim that we should introduce laws against anti-animal hate speech tomorrow. But it could be that in a more just world, a world where animals' rights are respected much more than they are today, these kinds of laws could find a place. Now, I'm going to suggest the alternative in a second, but we'll stick with that for now. So let me move on to another harm-based objection let me put that another way. Another harm-based justification of the discrepancy. So it might be that the White Defence League's words wrongfully deny the society membership of non-white humans. However, the Human Defence League's words do not wrongfully deny the society membership of animals, given that animals are not members of our political community. Now, this is an idea that we're borrowing from Jeremy Waldron, who's a political philosopher who wrote a very widely read book, I think about 2013, 2014, something like that, called The Harm of Hate Speech. Waldron's theory of hate speech draws on the idea of wounding and hostile environment, but it develops in a different kind of way. He thinks that the harm in hate speech is something objective. For him, it lies in the fact that such speech denies an individual's equal status or civic dignity. It is harmful, according to him, because it undermines the recognition of those individuals as equal members of the community. He thus sees hate speech as a form of group defamation. It not only denigrates certain individuals on the basis of their belonging to certain groups, but attacks their reputation as individuals with equal membership, rights, standing, and belonging in that community. But here's the problem with this attempt at a defence of the discrepancy. We believe that animals are also core members of our society. So we draw upon the work of Sue Donaldson and Will Kinlicker here, the authors of Zoopolis, and they situate animals as members of our political communities entitled to rights of membership. Not just rights against being killed, for example, or rights against being tortured, but rights to belong, rights to the kinds of social protections entitled only to members of our society, or particular societies. Now, Donaldson and Kinlicker are animal rights theorists, but what's really fascinating is this idea of membership is not unique to animal rights theory. There's actually a whole range of theorists who are not at all animal rights theorists who very strongly endorse this idea of animal membership in our community. Kimberly Smith, the historian, is one. Elizabeth Anderson, a philosopher who's very critical of animal rights, or at least critical of many formulations of animal rights, is another. Mary Midgley, a very famous moral philosopher, is another. She frames animals as members of our community as kind of central to our ethical obligations towards them. So these are not radical animal rights theorists, yet nonetheless they share this recognition that animals are members of our community. And if animals are members of our community, they could have the kind of civic dignity that Waldron affirms and that is required in order to make sense of the idea that individuals are harmed by hate speech. Individuals are harmed because their civic dignity is undermined, and if non-human animals, or at least some non-human animals, are members, they too could have civic dignity that could be undermined by hate speech. So yes, depending on our particular conception of membership, the standing might be unequal, or it might only be some animals, but that still reveals something of real interest. It also reveals that some animals, to some extent at the very least, could be afforded the protection of hate speech laws on Waldron's account. Now, Waldron is no animal rights theorist, very far from it. He's actually very critical of animal rights. One thought that I think emerges from this is someone could respond, well, animals, all well and good, animals should be recognised as members of our community, but they are not recognised now. So it doesn't make sense to say that they have civic dignity now. But actually, fascinatingly, there's resources in Waldron to respond to this. And it's the opposite response to what I gave in the previous slide. I'm going to quote Waldron now. Societies do not become well-ordered by magic. The expressive and disciplinary work of law may be necessary as an ingredient in the change of heart within its racist citizens that a well-ordered society presents. But if that argument works in the case of hate speech towards racial minorities and the changing of heart of racist citizens, why shouldn't it work in the changing of norms concerning non-human animal members of our societies and changes in the heart of speciesist citizens? Hate speech laws can be a part of the path towards this richer society that is required, not just something to be realised in this richer future ideal society. There's also the harm of undermining assurance. And the idea is that individuals are entitled to assurance that they are not going to be attacked or their dignity is not going to be undermined. Again, it's quite Waldronian, but I don't want to get into that. I come to my conclusion. Let me first throw out a few caveats. So some arguments that we've explored depend upon accepting some quite minimal, but I think certainly plausible account of animal rights or animal membership. We haven't reviewed every possible theory of hate speech, but in good faith, we have analysed what we take to be the best ones. We genuinely don't know what other route there might be to defending the discrepancy. And we allow, this is a slightly technical point, which I'm getting to in Q&A if necessary, we allow that a prima facie reason for criminalisation may not, all things considered, justify criminalisation in every case. However, these caveats, I conclude that we have found no good reason to endorse the discrepancy between the treatment of the White Defence League and the Human Defence League. And that means that either there is good reason to criminalise both racist and speciesist hate speech in principle, or in principle, neither should be criminalised. Okay, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Josh. That was great. And can I invite now Josh and Jesseka and Tom